Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today, it's episode 29, Serving Style with a Single Color. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Takeup. I am Eric Campbell, and today we are talking about single color embroidery work, and we're going to get into a little bit of detail, talk about some of the things that I have been listening to as far as other people in the industry discussing single color work and discussing their digitizing and embroidery work in general and how it relates to single color work. As I always say, I like to get elemental with things. I like to get down to the essentials, meaning that when we get down to the basics of how stitches work and the interaction between thread and file and stabilizer and fabric and the machine, we can start to understand things in a way that lets us do more complicated work. And one of the best things we can do is to work on single color design, single color work, to understand the nature of thread, the nature of embroidery. So we're going to talk a little bit about both what can you do with a single color? What can you do when you don't have color as a way of making your designs more interesting? What can we do to increase the visual impact of a single color design? What are the important parts of single color design? And then we're going to discuss a little bit about what in a single color design, in the execution and the digitizing of a single color design, we can learn that helps us with more detailed work, with digitizing, with planning for our other work that can be more detailed, that can be more interesting. And honestly, I think that we're going to go over some territory that's old territory, stuff we've talked about before, and get into some new territory. What I'm hoping for is maybe a slightly more concise show that I usually do, something that has a little bit of impact, a little bit of understanding on a basic level, some of that essential elemental work that can help us all out. But while we have people here, I'm going to go ahead and say hi to the people in the comments. I always like to bring you guys in. Cindy King jumping in saying, good afternoon, just 105 right now. Absolutely. It is hot. It is not as hot here, but it has been. So I hope you're doing all right out there in Texas. Tom Farr coming in. Hello from New Bedford, Mass. Happy to see you here, Tom Farr. You are no stranger to doing a nice design for sure. Justin Armenta, Digitizer. Hello and happy Friday to everyone. Had a great chat on the M-Nerd group, and we had Jerry Lee Medeiros and myself and Jeff Fuller, who's on here, and Justin Armenta on doing a kind of an Ask an Expert roundtable, which was really cool. So awesome stuff to see there. We had got to talk about that. And actually, one of the reasons I decided to kind of add some of the things I did to this topic were some discussions we had during that. So it was going to be a cool time, right? Is it something awesome that we can take a look at? I love to bounce ideas off you guys. I really want you guys to jump in the comments and get together with me on this, because every time you guys bring in conversation, it helps to broaden the scope of what we're talking about. And it brings up new things. Like I always think that in conversation, we can do more together than we could do separately, because we can bounce things off each other. We come from our own perspectives. We come from our own experiences, and it's always interesting to get that interaction. Frank Dunn coming in from the UK. Good evening, all. Good evening, Frank. Good stuff from, I believe from Sweden. I've lost my mind and forgotten, sir, but happy to have you in. Thank you for tuning in all the way over there. Donna Scott Johnson, hi, happy Friday. Don't know how much Friday means to most of those entrepreneurial folks these days, but happy Friday to you. Hoping you have a good weekend. Jeff Fuller, yay, hello, worried I would miss it. Oh, Jeff, like you need it, man. You've done all the classes and you're teaching the classes, but happy to have you in as well. Sonia Stiles, hi, everyone. Hi, Sonia. And by the way, everybody in the group, if you're in Facebook, you're probably getting a little bit more comment love talking to each other, but there's also folks in YouTube, so go ahead and talk amongst yourselves in the comments too. If there's something great, if there's something that I want to bring up for everybody, I will show it on screen as you see here, and we will get into it. Mark Wood, afternoon. Happy to see you here. John Dinan, hey, must be Friday. Looking forward to another great talk. Well, I hope I can deliver. This one might have a little less content to it, but maybe won't ramble quite so bad. And I already know people are taking bets on bonus time, right? Darren, thanks for you for tuning in all the way from Bulgaria. Awesome. Greetings to you, Darren. Ramona, I still have 2 machines running, working on a tutorial video and adding content to my site layout, but I couldn't not be here. You know what? I appreciate it. And trust me, I'm a little hurried today because I was also working on some site layout and some video stuff just a minute ago. So yeah, everybody is always busy. Everybody asks me, oh, so do you just prep for the next show between this and the show I do in the morning, 2 Regular Guys? I actually was on this morning live on screen this time because I was co-hosting and talking about packaging. If you want to go check that one out, tworegularguys.com, that the archive of that will be up shortly. And we talked all about packaging and shipping and a new kind of reusable mailer from a company called Lime Loop. So that was actually really cool too. So interesting stuff going on right there. Frank Dunn, only 68 degrees here. Nice. Much nicer, I think, than 105. But, I also have to admit, whenever somebody starts with Fahrenheit and Celsius, I'm useless. I don't know that off the top of my head, which is hilarious since I tell everybody to do metrics. And by the way, let's go ahead and give you your public service announcement for the day. Embroidery is metric. An embroidery point, when we talk about points and density, is 1/10 of a millimeter. And if you need to know, 25.4 millimeters is 1 inch. Learn it, love it, live it. It's better to work in metrics at small distances and embroidery. So maybe I should take my own example and learn Celsius as well. Donna Scott Johnson says, nice break. My website is 3 days from launching. Awesome. Boy, do I know that feeling. Have been working on a lot of website stuff myself lately. And great to get close. Unnerving to flip the switch, right? So happy to see you working on the website. It is a web world right now. It is an e-commerce world. Great to work on. And Ramona has a pretty cool site. Yeah, I got to see a little bit of it. Didn't get to see more, but great site and great work. So awesome to see you guys improving that stuff. Silvio, hello from Romania. Middle of the night here. Man, thank you for tuning in. And I hope you get something out of it. So yeah, let's see what we can talk about with single color designs and see if we have something that'll be helpful for everybody. Like I said, anybody wants to come in with topics, come in with questions, ask what you want to, comment where you want to, because this is something that I think we can all discuss and enjoy. But here's the thing. I'm going to say first that I am a big fan of single color designs. Everybody who's been to one of my classes or who's heard me speak knows that I really love simple, elegant designs. I'm very much into classic work, some of the earliest work that we have in machine embroidery. I really enjoy texture and the things that you can do with thread. Thread by its essence and embroidery by its essence is something that is three-dimensional. It is something that has depth. It has something that you cannot get out of print. It is an object. And one of the reasons that I really loved embroidery when I came into it is that I had been a kid who played with computers and who had always done like pixel graphics. I remember very distinctly when I first had a computer capable of 256 colors and was drawing pixel graphics for things like what would now be considered retro pixel style video game art. That was something I was doing very early on. I remember how dizzying it was to be able to make things on screen, and printing was incredible. But the first time I realized that I could make a physical object that you could touch, that you could see and feel and had texture from something that was digital, and that early on in my embroidery career, I was incredibly excited to play with that stuff. And that's something that single color designs, though, of course, multicolor designs, we can build up layers, we can do all of this stuff. We can use multimedia, we can use foam. It doesn't mean that color isn't involved, but there is something essential about reducing all of the different options you have and working in a single color. When we're not working with a wide range of colors, we boil things down, and that constriction of options means that we only have the nature of the thread, the nature of our materials, and the way we lay our stitches in order to make visual interest. And it's something like if you were, say, somebody who is into language, let's say you are a poet, it's like a haiku. A haiku has very strict rules. The thing is, it doesn't mean that you can't make beautiful poetry in a haiku. Absolutely not. What it means is those strict rules force you to work against that envelope, work against that barrier to make something cool. And I think when you're doing single color work, that's part of what you have to do. And I think that I would also include in this like monogramming, doing custom monograms, and especially detailed monograms, classic monograms, that kind of work I think also plays into it. And I've been doing a lot of typography and monogramming lately, which is probably not surprising since I've talked about it on the videos quite a lot. And for me, that is part and parcel of this single color work of refining your shapes, of refining your stitch types, of working on dimension and layering and the way things go together. And I have really always enjoyed it. So for me, single color work is always something something impressive, something that I really have loved working on. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about it. Let's see what we can get into with that. And the first thing I want to bring up again, the first thing I want to stress is that single color work can be interesting despite all of this restriction, because embroidery by its very nature is dimensional. If you think about embroidery less as reproducing a printed item, if you think about it less as reproducing art that is digital, and think about it as a dimensional object, this is the first thing that is going to teach you how to digitize properly, in my opinion, out of these categories. Embroidery is dimensional. You're building up a low relief sculpture, like a bas relief sculpture. If you've ever seen like a pediment, you've seen like Roman sculpture where you will have like this flat background, and protruding from it are are figures and are people and shapes, and they have gathers of fabric and their arms and faces and hands, and they're just partially protruding from the surface. That's what embroidery is like. We have the capacity to make actual dimensional objects. Now, we're not talking about something that's molded. We're not talking about something like 3D printing, but we do have real dimension because we have layers, we have levels of height, we have stacking, we have the ability to make embroidery actually dimensional. And with the nature of thread, the fact that when you look at stitch angles, as a stitch angle changes, the way the light reflects off of a block of stitches changes as well. And it changes the color and the value of the light that's returning from that block of stitches. Because we have that, it means we have light, shadow, shine, we have highlights, and we have this darkness, we have shapes, and we have dimension. And all of this can be done and worked with in the single color. And that's what I think is really important about that. Remembering that embroidery is dimensional, that we're building it in layers, that when we talk about our sequencing, it's not just sequencing because we're talking about how many times can we avoid changing colors. Sequencing is also layering. It's also what goes first, what goes on top of that, and how does that play into how dimensional a piece looks. When I talk about this in digitizing, people always ask me, how do you build an embroidery design? And I usually say from the back of the picture plane to the front, wherever you can. You're not always going to do that. And when you have borders or other things that are occluding edges and you can hide transitions, you can make things look like they're on top of each other, even if they're out of sequence. However, when we're building something in a single color and we're trying to layer things out, building from the back of the picture plane, what I mean is the way we're looking at a design, building from what's furthest from you to what's closest to you in the design and the objects that are in the design is part of how you do it. And when we're talking about things that are abstract like text, we think about strokes. We think about how a letter is written, and we can say what stroke goes first, what stroke goes on top of it if we were thinking about this like calligraphy. And once again, it still gives this essence, this sense of what is further behind, what is on top, what is first, what is second, what is last. And I think it provides dimension. So one of the things we want to think about is dimension. So what we're really talking about, though, is what we can control. What are the things that we can control in single color embroidery, and how can we actually affect the way the embroidery looks? Well, let's go through some of these things briefly, and then I'll show some examples and talk about perhaps some articles that I've got on. I've written articles very similar to this several times. I'm going to go ahead and give you one that is a slightly older article that's online, but it's online fully and not in a PDF and not in a printed format. So it's something that's a little easier to use. But if you've seen me talk about this stuff, I've talked about it quite a lot. This will be similar points, but should be some interesting stuff to discuss. In any case, let's talk first about what we can control. What can we control when we're talking about single color designs? The first thing we can control is texture. We know that the way our stitches are put together affects texture. Satin stitches are long and shiny and smooth. Fill stitches have a tendency, though they are smooth, they look a little less smooth, less shiny perhaps than satins. And we can control how regular the stitches are. If we use randomness on a fill, that randomness can make a more organic look. We have texture, we have roughness. So even when we're talking about the same thread, now we're going to get into the fact that texture is also controlled through thread. If we use thick threads, if we use threads that have a furry aspect to them, a fuzzy aspect to them, let's say we go with spun polyester instead of going directly with a shiny polyester or rayon. Let's say we go all the way out to a wool blend or a wool acrylic blend thread that looks almost like a yarn that has a great deal of fuzz, of furriness, of hairiness. Then we have a different texture we can work with. Also, thin versus thick thread. Thicker thread is coarser, thinner thread is finer, and that changes the look. So without changing color, we can change a great deal about texture. We can have that change what we're doing. And when we're talking about stitch types, whether it's in a fill or it's in a straight stitch, manual stitch, whatever it is, if we have lines of smaller stitches, because we have more frequent shadows, we get a more pebbly look, especially on light colors on dark. Light single colors on a dark background, we get a more pebbly look, a rougher look, where a longer stitch will have a smoother look, though we'll still have a nice shadow at the penetration point that we have to either deal with if we don't want it or enjoy if we're trying to use it. The thing is, where these stitch penetration points are placed is also part of texture. If you're talking about patterned fills, which is certainly something you can discuss, if we're talking about the way we split up satin stitches, the way we overlap things, or the regularity of a fill stitch, that texture is under our control. So by the way we set our variables on stitch types, we control the texture. Rougher, smoother, more organic, more mechanical, more geometric. We can work with those things. We can have special textures, and all of these things play into the final look of the piece. When we're talking about, again, about the thread, we have sheen. And this is slightly different than texture because we're talking about what's on an individual thread. That means we have everything from super shiny rayon, super shiny polys, metallic threads that have a great deal of reflection. They have those specular highlights. They have a strong shine. That sheen versus standard polyester. And we can even have slightly rougher or slightly less rough polyesters. And thickness, as I said, plays into this to some degree. We can also have matte finish threads. If you look at like the matte poly, especially Madeira, I hate to say, but they've got really the one very, very smooth, flat, solid color matte poly that doesn't show a lot of shadows and highlights. So it creates this really solid tonal value whenever you use it. So we have that. We have matte finishes. And then once again, we have the furry threads. We have the threads that have texture that's part of the fiber themselves. So cotton threads and wool blend threads and spun polyester that has a little bit of fuzz to it. These things affect our sheen. So once again, same color value, we can use the same color value, same hue, and get differences out of the sheen of the thread. So we have the texture, which we can control partially through digitizing and partially through materials. Then we have the sheen, and that's really about materials. We have the depth. And once again, that's building in layering. When we build in layers, when we talk about going from the front to the back, when we layer and we overlap, when we have an object and another object lays on top of it and occludes it, naturally, just like my hand is in front of my face right now, your mind tells you that if this thing is covering the thing in the back, even if it just looks like it is in the design, that this thing is closer to us. And because embroidery is actually dimensional and lays a certain thickness as we work on it, especially if we use dimensional underlays, if we use underlays that lift up the top stitching, we can end up with things that are actually further forward, that sit forward in the plane and have natural shadows and shines and shadows and highlights. That creates depth, and depth is something we have entirely in single colors. So before I will go through all of the different things we're talking about, let's go ahead and jump over. I'm going to share my screen and give you guys a look at first at this article that I was discussing, and then we're going to look at some of the samples that are in it, and we can discuss some of the things that are in there. But let's go ahead and bring that up on screen. And this is the article that I'm talking about. I'm going to go ahead and show this to you. This one was more from a home craft kind of art basis than it was from essentially kind of a commercial basis. So some of these things don't really go into as much of the commercial work we can. So this may not have quite as much about digitizing involved in it, but it does have a little bit of discussion about the qualities. And like I said, we're talking about single colors and what we can do with them. And so these are some of my favorite single color designs. We'll see these again as we go through, but we can talk about texture. And as we can see, different stitch types have different textures. If we bring this design up, you can actually see that. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and go into my own photos because I have some photos of this that are higher quality, and hopefully we'll play it a little bit nicer for everybody on screen. And we'll see if we can get into these. This piece, done on a work shirt. It was done for Al Unser Racing, did this here. And this was actually done off of a photograph. So it wasn't exactly this look. This was a photograph, and I interpreted pieces of this photograph. It actually had color. It was redone in a vector art piece. So this was actually taking something that was multicolored, and they wanted to render it in a light open work piece that was done for the back of a work shirt. Now, this particular one comes out of my bag a little bit roughly. I'll have to say it's got a little bit more wrinkling in it than I would like. But as I will tell you, it happens for a lot of us in the industry. A lot of my samples that I still have are actually reject samples that had to be redone. This one was not in the best of condition. I don't think the hoop tension was great on this guy. But what is interesting about it is we can look really tightly at the texture. And we were talking about textures in general, and I want to show you this piece here. This down here, which this is all one filament of thread, by the way. There are no trims, I believe, aside from the jump to this 2. The entire car is one solid filament of thread with no jumping. And in fact, if I'm correct, I jump out into this piece as well. And there probably was a trim here as well. But there really shouldn't have been. Suffice it to say, this car is one big piece of thread. We know that there's nothing else being done. There are no other tricks. But what do we have involved here? First thing we're going to show, we've got texture in the fill. Down here, this piece was supposed to be on kind of a dirt track. So what do we have? We've got line value showing us some texture. We've got density showing us some things. So we've got these lines here that are rough and have some randomness to them because these were done manually. These little stitch lines down here are manual stitch lines. So you can see that that's how those turned out. They have a little bit of roughness. They look organic. But then if you look at the fill that's done down here, this fill stitch, it has a bit of randomness as well. I could have done this in a solid regular tatami fill stitch with no randomness involved. And if you do that, if you have no roughness, no randomness, it doesn't really look like much. It's a shadow. You would think, why do I need any detail in there? Well, the truth of the matter is because this detail is essentially going to give us the idea of the texture of the ground that I can't see. I don't have the rest of this dirt track around me, but the fact that this has roughness in it makes the shadow look like it's on a bumpy surface. So I'm trying to tell you something about that surface that is going on in this piece, right? So that's something interesting in and of itself. Also, you're going to see the difference between, of course, the sheen that we have on our thread. This is a polyester thread, a fairly standard polyester thread, but we're going to see that we have a shine and a shadow. We're over here in this wheel, and we have a natural shadow and a natural shine on this that helps us define the tire. It defines the edge of the tire. And as we go through back here, you'll also see that in these various ribs in the tire and here, I'm using these nice satin stitches because I'm getting this natural ribbed look. I'm not having to work to try and get this tire to look ribbed or to look like it has ridges. I'm overlapping some satin stitches, and the natural shadow between those overlapped satins is giving me the form that's in the tire. And it doesn't seem like much until you back away from it and say, okay, this tire looks more realistic, looks more like what it should look like because of that little bit of detail. And if you look over here, you'll see that the body, this line that is the shadow under the edge of the body of the car, is stitched before the wheel. The wheel stitches on top of it. What do we have here? We have depth. As that other satin stitch comes over on top of this satin stitch that's in the center here, it tells the eye this piece is on top of this piece. It's occluding the background, and as it occludes the background, that tells us that that is in front. Working from the back of the picture plane to the front allows us to get a little more out of it. And you can see that these little steps, these little bits and pieces of texture help us to say more about what's going on in the image. And we get the idea that this ground is rough without having to do any extra work, without having to shade it, without a gradient. We have a shadow that is rough, and it looks like we have dirt on the ground. So it's one of those things that's pretty interesting. I think that it's worthwhile looking at. And in general, you can see what we're talking about. We're talking about stitches. Also, you can kind of see how where we have these very small kind of jagged stitches that are, they look very pebbly. You see how these lines look pebbly? Now, admittedly, there's some direction going on that makes that happen. But when we look at longer stitches that are not offset, that run in a line, they don't look the same roughness. They don't look as rough as these small, short stitches. So longer stitches are going to give you a more smooth appearance. The shorter stitches, especially when we're changing direction a lot, are going to give you a rough appearance. So this is all done in a single color. And I think that's something that's worth looking at. Certainly, I think if I would say my most famous single color piece, I'll go ahead and scroll down to it now. This is my example piece that I always show, and I'll go ahead and pull this up as well in the photos so we get a better look at it. But this piece is another one of the pieces that I show pretty readily when we're talking about making one color of thread do something. Now, certainly, why am I using metallic thread here? Metallic thread is going to give me incredibly high highlights and nice dark shadows if done correctly. And this particular piece, you are looking at one color of thread. None of this is shaded. There is not a second color of metallic in it. The only difference we have in this piece is all up to texture, stitch angle, directions, stitch type, stitch length. That's all we're using to get that texture out of this single color. So to look at this piece, we can go ahead and actually zoom in on it a little bit. And I'm sure if I zoom in, you'll see all my sins, all the bad things I've done. But this piece is actually done on a pretty coarse piece of canvas. So you have to forgive a little bit of edge quality issues here. but this is all in a single color of thread. And what you can see pretty readily with this is that we've got these different textures coming into play. Why do I have a super high highlight on the bridge of this nose? Because I have a long satin and a length limited satin bridge on that nose, and that angle, as you see, anytime the stitches are hitting that angle, because of the way the light is in this picture, anytime we have the length, or that the length of that stitch is on that angle, we can see the highlights. When I'm over here, you'll see this is bright, that same angle here is bright, it's bright over here, it's bright down here, because as the light passes over this thing, or as we know, these are usually going on apparel, they're going on a human being, a round cylindrical object that's going to turn and move with different light sources around you, you're going to get this effect like a faceted gem, where if we use these broken up elements, these different stitch types and textures, we can get something more out of our single colors. And I can go ahead and kind of list it here, but it's not like you really need the list, but you can see what I'm talking about. Unbroken big satin stitches here, length limited satin gives us a lot of shine. We have down here in the jawline, it's made up of several satin stitches, both length limit and split satin, overlap satin, that are making the curvature of the jawline, that are making the texture. And then the lip is on top of the jaw and is on top of the teeth. The teeth run before the lip so that the lip occludes them and the lip is further forward in the picture plane. The same thing with that chin and the little strip on the chin. These things are in front. The back jawline is behind those teeth that are on the upper jaw. The upper jaw comes in later. Now, there are some places where I've cheated this. You can see that I swept up from the lower jaw into this piece so that I could cover up this juncture in here, but I don't think it really does anything to offend the piece. The upper lip is below the nose. Now, the eyes are set in a little differently. The actual piece, this is a Japanese no mask. It's a theater mask. And the actual piece had these eye covers that were very far forward set in, but they were under the head, the forehead, and the brow ridge, but they were up on top of the cheeks, these big eye plates. So it looks more like that. It's not like the eye on an actual figure would be. But you can see how we have this fill stitch that's inside the ear. Because we have that texture, it sets further back. It's not as shiny. There's smaller stitches in it. Shorter stitches are going to be less shiny. Longer stitches are going to be more shiny. So we have the long unbroken stitches around the edge, around the top of the ear. And you'll see that we're using a regular fill. It is regular. It's not random. But we have a curved fill over the top of the forehead. And curved fills like this produce a shine because that angle of the stitches changes as we go track around the curve. It makes it look like an actual object that is bent forward, that is convex, that is forward in space, and it helps with that shine and it helps with that shadow. So you can see how all of this comes together, single color, and we have a tremendous amount of depth and visual interest. If you filled this thing from bottom to top with one fill at a 0-degree angle, there would be zero dimension to it. You wouldn't be able to see anything about it. So this does also certainly make the case for breaking up objects into multiple pieces, but it shows us how we can control a single color of stitches, a single color of thread with our stitch types, with our settings to make things run well. Now I'm going to go ahead and jump into a couple of people who said hi and pick up people who are making some comments out here. First, Brian Bailey, creator of Embrilliance, and I'm in the Embrilliance studios as we speak in my office, as you know. Greetings from New Mexico, USA. That's where I'm at, New Mexico, if you didn't know. Andrea from ZSK USA loves this topic. Absolutely. I love this topic too. And honestly, I'm going to be showing more things like this. I had some footage I wanted to show that I couldn't show yet with, honestly, just some cool stuff going on with embroidered text. We'll have to see how that goes. Maybe I'll show it at the end anyway. And Jeff says, one of the cooler things I've seen is brushed woolly thread. You show at Dax? Yeah, I actually showed somebody else's sample, one of the samples from the ZSK booth, because that was something that was really kind of cool. They were showing running as it was going on. One of the things we can do with woolly thread is brush woolly thread. And when you brush woolly thread, you actually get an animal fur-like appearance. And I may bring that back up at some point. It's something cool that you can do. I think that there's a little bit to talk about with wearability and washability with that, but I still think it's a pretty interesting way to work with texture and thread. You can brush that woolly thread and get a very fur-like appearance. Very interesting stuff. And let's go ahead and see a couple things people are talking about. Currently using Luminary glow in the dark, not liking the texture of the thread at all. It's rough and thick. Reminds me of dental floss. You know, a lot of specialty threads can have difficult textures. Old school metallics, despite having lovely specular highlights and shimmer, the kinking of the foil sometimes looks pretty bad to me too. Same way, it looks really rough. And sometimes I actually like a metallic colored thread done well. It's why I like a good old gold. If you know Madeira rayons, I remember from early in my career, 1070 Madeira rayon was my favorite old gold for having a metallic looking gold, but it wasn't metallic at all. And I will say a lot of rough and thick things, but here's what I'm going to say. You don't like it for what you're doing now. Imagine you wanted that texture. One of the great things about playing with different kinds of threads is saying, okay, here's a different kind of texture that I'm getting. Here's a different quality I'm getting. But now I want that quality, or what could I do with the quality now that I have it? Maybe it's not working for my current project. What could I do with the quality now that I have it? It's something to look at. Cindy says, that's fantastic. I think it's one color. Yeah, you know what? Honestly, anybody can do this work. It's all about developing that eye for embroidery. Go back to that episode if you haven't seen it, folks. Developing the eye for embroidery and learning how to break things up. It's really cool stuff. And Lisa jumps on and says she has some of that too. Not so lovely. She's using Mettler glow in the dark and has a smoother texture. I haven't tried Mettler, but yeah, try it out. I mean, Lisa knows because Lisa's done a lot of work with those threads, so it's really awesome. A couple more comments first. Clay, great example of depth of that demon image. Yeah, I like that one. This Oni is pretty cool. I like this one. Hanya mask is actually, I believe, what it's called. And Mark says metallic thread is the devil, where, well, this particular demon's a little more metallic thread for sure. Finish size on this, Lisa, I'd have to look up again, but this is, I believe this is only about 3 inches tall from the horn to the chin. I'll have to look that up to tell you, but the finish size, this is not a very large piece. And let me jump that back up a little larger. You can actually see, because we've got some pretty wide satins here. These satins are probably, once I'm breaking, this would be 7 millimeters. So yeah, it's probably not much more than 3 inches tall. So that's something interesting too. Oh, and by the way, I'll go ahead and bring this up because this is absolutely something that I agree with in my experience. Jeff Fuller says, one interesting thing that I did was take 5 different brands of black thread. Each gave a different feel as well as shine. Absolutely. I will say that using, and I'll say that's not even due always to fiber content. I've used different polyester threads, and due to the way that the thread is put together, due to the way that it's wound, the directions, and sometimes you'll actually find, I found somebody who tried to kind of say they like to use a certain kind of thread because it's inexpensive. And that piece, that thread that they showed me actually was not trilobal. It didn't have 3 strands in the thread. It had 2, and it had a very wobbly look. And it's kind of funny. It gave a little wobbly edge to the stitches. It was kind of interesting. So yeah, very cool stuff. Something to think about. The kind of thread you use does make a difference to your eventual outcome. Let's go ahead and pull back into our sample stuff here. And the other thing I want to talk about with this, let's go ahead and go back to some of the topics we were talking about, right? We already talked a little bit about what? Texture. We discussed that, certainly. Sheen. We discussed how sheen plays into things, how we have something that's shiny or less shiny, and how that can play with light and what that can do for us. We've talked about depth, right? We talked about how something being in front or behind something. And even the piece that I have on screen right now, this piece is actually taken from a Viking Age piece. It's a Orderness style design. It was like a metal brooch, a bronze brooch that I repurposed. Actually, we did this for my wedding. At my wedding, we kind of had a seal that was the crest that it was on everything. And that's something I redrew, and I drew the cards all in a Viking Age style. And this is one of the pieces from that, but redone for my wife. She wanted it on a canvas tote bag, and this is something I actually had worked with on a customer in this piece. Super coarse canvas tote bag, bamboo canvas, and you can see that super coarse thread actually caused us to have some issues here. What you do see first, I'll talk about the depth, because I have let certain objects occlude others. And I think, let me see if we've got a photo of this in my own photo bank, because I think it's pretty important to actually get to see it closely to make a little more sense of it, despite the article being there. And I'll throw that out in the comments for you guys. First, let's go ahead and show you the entire piece. This is what the entire piece looks like on the bag, and it's a pretty large piece. But you can see this is an Orderness style, kind of an interlaced zoomorphic element. So it's kind of like a dragon or an animal. You can actually see, I'll go through it. Here's the head that's up on the top here. And let's see if you can see that. I don't know if you can see the piece or not. You can't see my cursor right now. There we go. Okay, it's not coming up on screen. But you can see that on the top of it is the head. The neck kind of swoops down into the right. And that we're also getting kind of a look at the legs, you'll see the chest is on the left-hand side and the legs are swooping back away from it. So it's a zoomorphic, it's an animal piece, but you can see how the different pieces lace in and out from each other, and I don't have to shade that. I don't have to do anything else with it. The occlusion of the satin stitches that are on top of other satin stitches gives you that sense. I know a lot of people who do Celtic knotwork do this stuff. Viking style interlace is a very similar design style, and you can see that this is tone on tone. So we're also talking about color. One of the other things we can control, of course, is color, because even though I said one single color of thread, it doesn't mean that we don't have color contrast between the ground, between our piece, between the garment we're working on, and the what we're doing with our thread, which also means that we can work with contrast. And when we start talking about density, we have different values that are made by the density of our stitching. But this particular piece, we'll first talk about depth. You can see that we're getting depth essentially what I would call for free. I always say that we get depth for free because the depth is actually coming from the fact that we have occlusion that naturally, as I ran these stitches and I sequenced them in such a way that the ends of these satin stitches are showing as underneath other satin stitches that are further toward me in the picture plane, that things look like they are really diving under and raising out. They look like a ribbon that is flowing in and out of other pieces. That depth is all had by the way we sequence our designs. And working with this kind of design will teach you a lot about sequencing. And actually, I'm going to get a little bit into some old school tips about how I first learned for myself how to deal with sequencing in black work and red work in a moment here. But that's one of the things we can control, right? We can control our depth in such a way that we can use our occlusion, we can use the layering to make depth, and by using underlay. If I use what I like to call a German underlay, we have a contour or an edge run underlay that's running under the edges of a satin stitch covered with a double zigzag. We have two zigzags. We have got that zigzag underlay, little X's all up and down. What we end up doing is we provide rails. We have edges for our satin stitches to grab onto, and we provide these X's, these braces, so that every stitch is going over at least 4 other stitches in a little configuration. Like we have a little plank border and these rails that it rides on. And so that satin stitch wraps over those and it stands up. Now, there are people who use, there are softwares that do this thing called a 3D satin. And it's just like narrower, like a narrow satin covered on another satin that's a little wider, another satin that's wider than that. I think that's too much density and it's a little bit extra. I don't think that it gives me enough dimension for me to really use that on much. I can imagine maybe on home decor, something that would never be worn, I might do that. But the one time I had somebody say they like to use it instead of 3D foam on their headwear, they showed me this hat they had, and I joke you not, it had a big piece in the front done with that, and the same amount of bobbin thread is building up toward the back as is building up on the front, and so it left an impression of the athletic letter on your forehead if you wore the thing too tight, because it had an incredible buildup of thread in the back. So the 3D satins I'm not into. I am into, however, using nice structural underlays to build a foundation on which that top stitching is going to lay down. We get depth out of that too by literally building rails. We have to think about it in 3D plane. Like, here's our garment, then the garment is the ground we're standing on, and on top of that ground, we're going to lay our little rails of underlay, and then we wrap our tent, you know, it's up on these poles of our top stitching on top of it. And we can really make dimension without adding a ton of density by using structural underlay and thinking about it structurally. So that's one of the things we can control. Single color depth, we're still controlling that. We're not having to go to another color to make that depth happen. We're getting it from the sheen, we're getting it from the shadow and the shine that is natural, especially on a satin stitch. So as you can see, that's what we're getting here. Like I said, also we have our color. And that color, in this case, we're actually making this subdued. But what I will say, we have also a texture element, because in this case, the texture that I'm working with that's different is the texture of the actual item that I'm working on. This piece, this bamboo canvas tote, is incredibly rough. And actually the fabric, it's not being done justice by the shot, because I really wanted to get that off-angle shot that has that lovely shine. We're getting a little bit too much of natural light coming in on that one corner. It's a much rougher, much more subdued texture and less light that's reflected from the bag, whereas I've used a polyester thread on the top that has enough shine to it that the shine itself is part of what sets it apart from the bag. So if I go back to the original, you can see it a little bit better here. Still, I shot this in natural light and it was a little too hot. I really need to find this sample and shoot it again. But you can still see how much brighter that is in this shot. It looks like I'm using a separate color in that tone on tone that's much brighter. But if you go back to this shot, the detail shot, you can see in the shadows, This tone, the tone of the thread is very, very close to the bag. This is what I would call a tonal or a tone-on-tone or almost a monochromatic kind of expression, where really I'm just using sheen, I'm using that shine of the thread, I'm using the texture, I'm using the depth in order to create visual interest in the piece. And I think that's something that's interesting to look at as well. So we can control these things. So let's kind of review that for a second. Before we go on to digitizing and what this stuff helps us with, let's review just for a second the kind of things we can expect from that. And honestly, I'm going to show you a couple more samples while we do that. So what are we looking at? What can we control when we're talking about a single color, when we're not going to shade, when we're not going to use anything else of a second color or multiple colors to give us visual interest? What are we going to control? We're going to control texture. We're going to be able to use the length of the stitches. Like I said, long stitches are shinier, shorter stitches are more pebbly or rougher, and the regularity of the stitch penetrations. How even and how predictable the stitch penetrations are is read when we look at things as smoothness. So regular stitch penetrations in a fill look very smooth, look regular, look mechanical. Rough, randomized stitch penetrations in a fill make it look more organic, especially if we treat the edge in a way, maybe we feather or we make the edge jagged, and in that feathering or that jaggedness, even very small amounts of jaggedness in an edge can make something look more homespun, more rough, have a different feeling. Two different pieces with just a little bit of roughness on an edge and a change to the randomness in the fill can very much change the way they look immediately. It can make things look more organic or less organic, more mechanical or less mechanical immediately. So texture is one of the things we can control very readily in our designs. Sheen, and this is absolutely something that is going to be more to do with your materials, or at least it's very easy to change with materials. The same single color design done in 3 sheens will definitely change things for you very readily. You can certainly say that the sheen of different materials, the different threads plays into this very readily. And I think that that's, pardon me for that, that's something that we take for granted to some degree, because a lot of us are using one kind of rayon thread, one kind of polyester thread all the time, especially in commercial work where it's standardized, and we may not think of that sheen. The other thing is there really is a difference in sheen, I think, from using a thinner thread versus a thicker thread. There's a difference in the edge quality. Certainly, everybody talks about the edge quality when you're going to a 60 weight or a 75 from a 40 weight, but also you get this kind of fineness and the reflection is a little different. So there's a difference in the sheen with thickness as well. Same thing with going coarser. You go to 30 weight thread and you're going to get a coarser look, not a ton, a little bit of a coarser look than you do with a 40 weight. So that's something that we can control as well. We can control depth because we have the ability to build. We can overlap satins. We can overlap objects on top of each other. We can build out of objects that have that dimension. We build from the back of the plane to the front of the plane. And that's something that we can do as well to produce that visual interest. If we treat the object that we're looking at like it's a real object in space, like we're making a sculpture, and build it in that fashion, we can get all that depth that we want. And then we can start controlling some other things. Like I said, density. And let's go ahead and go back to some samples to talk about this. Because when we're talking about a piece like this, right? We're talking about a piece like this that I showed you earlier, and I'll show you something else more detailed. But when we're discussing density, everybody assumes that we're talking about how close together satin stitches, fill stitches, or lines in that section are, right? They're thinking that that's something that has to be a setting in your design. But the truth of the matter is density is always a measure between lines of stitches, a measure of how much space exists between lines of stitching. Well, if you don't think that there isn't density here, the same way there is in a fill, there is. When we look at our shading in a single color piece, if we look at how open things are or how tight things are, that density is also part of the look, because what we're essentially doing is, number one, we're defining objects, and when they look closer together or when they look further apart, that changes the look. It also changes the color value, the tone of the area we're looking at. Any given square inch or any given object, of course, as we add more lines, it is more the color of the thread than it is the color of the background, and we're establishing some tone with that. Of course, we know that we've got a darker, more solid color on the bottom of this particular piece at the bottom here in the shadow than we do up toward the top when we're looking at some of the open work that's there. So density is there, but also you have to look at how open, how clear we can make details in a piece. And really, density is what gives us shading. So if we're talking about that, and I've got some other pieces to show you here, but let's go ahead and look at the face detail here on another piece that I've shown quite a lot. And that would be essentially in this piece we like to call the Pizza Man. It's probably not the nicest way to call it. The Dion's logo is a very engraving styled piece. Some people think of it as red work. I wouldn't call this classical red work because of the different stitch types that are involved. And it's certainly a logo piece. It's not very much like classical red work. But if we look at the piece here, there is definitely a difference in density between the shadows and the highlights. And we're not using, at this point, we're not using the sheen really. If I executed this in a thread that was entirely matte, in a polyester matte frosted finish thread, you would still have that same quality. And in fact, I would say this kind of piece often looks very good in a frosted matte kind of thread. It often looks quite nice. I believe I've got some other pieces like that, where it's like these sorts of blackwork pieces. This piece was done in a standard polyester, and you can actually see little tiny bits of shine on the stitches. On the high end of each stitch has a little bit of shine, and it looks less solid. Whereas some people would prefer a piece like this. And this is not the best picture of this piece. Very small piece with a lot of detail in it. It's running on that polyester, that matte thread. And that matte thread runs a little thin. It runs more like it's a 50 weight. This, because it's done in a matte finish thread, there's less shine and shadow, and it actually looks very solid, and it gives an even tone, so that the lines I have out here in the details, out here in the grapes and in the tree branches and the foliage and the little apple barrels, those lines don't break up as much, don't become as pebbly, because I don't have the shine from that sheen of the standard polyester thread. But in any case, if we go back over here to the Dion's Pizza Man, what can we see about the Pizza Man? Well, that we have some openness in the areas that are important, that need to be bright and show forth. We want to have those bright areas. Now, it should be that way in the art, but it's something we're thinking about, that we want to control density. We want to make sure that some areas are uncomplicated. And in single colors, one of the things we can do is control how we allow space to exist. And in the face here, we have a lot of clarity. And what I'll say is, in working with the art on this piece, we have to learn what lines to leave out, and we have to work with density. Because as you can see, up here in this part of the face, and you can actually, once again, my pointer for some reason has disappeared here, folks, but over on the side of the face, on the cheek, on what is the right-hand side, you're seeing that that side of the cheek, that shadow is pretty solid, but not quite. But then right up against the nose, it's entirely solid. A lot of this is all rendered in manual stitches. So it's not a satin stitch that I'm laying down here. It's manually put together, but they are so close together that they are essentially a satin stitch. They're a satin stitch with a rough edge. Why is that? Because I'm approaching complete density. If you look very closely at that, I'm sure that I'm at 0.42 mils apart on my sets of rows, my passes, so that what I'm achieving is essentially a solid coverage. The thing is, you don't always want a solid coverage, so you do have to look at density. Working in a single color like this, especially black work and red work that has a lot of detail, will teach you a lot about density, because as you run it out, or as you measure it, but especially once you're running it out, you will notice that you can't put lines too close together and expect to get detail out of it. You're going to get maybe the kind of detail you have out of a curved fill instead of the detail you would have from an engraving style set of separated lines. And so this is one of the things we learn about digitizing for all work from working on single color designs. We learn how to control density, and we learn how to control it manually. Also, if you look at these stitches, most of these lines here are actually done in 2 passes. There's 1 pass out, 1 pass back, and they're very well controlled, because what we understand from doing single color work, especially straight stitch work, is that every pass we make along a line adds thickness. Thread doesn't sit on top of itself. We can't have a line out and a line back and have the same thickness as a straight line across. We are leaving a physical object behind, and it's going to go somewhere. So 2 passes is thicker. 3 passes is thicker than that. 4 passes is even thicker. So as you're traveling through a design, it also helps you to learn pathing. Pathing and density will go hand in hand on this kind of design, because as we go more times over a line, it gets thicker, and as it gets thicker, it gets closer to the lines that are nearby it. So when you're working on these engraving style designs, you have to realize that that density is there and you're building it up. The great thing is, because we understand what density is, it's a measurement of the space between lines, we can look at a design, take out a measuring tool and say, this design, if I run it in the way that it is here, I have this many lines of thread in this space, and I can compare it to a fully dense fill and say, okay, I'm getting close to that 0.4 line. And if I'm at 0.4, I'm going to end up where those passes of thread are going to look like a solid fill, and I'm not going to show any of the background. Understanding density and working with it in this way will help us when we want to do shading, when we want to do blending. More advanced topics, more advanced digitizing comes out of the basics of understanding how close together thread should be to look a certain way. And that's something we get out of working on solid color, single color designs. And I think that's pretty interesting, folks. Okay, now here's hilarious. I love to bring this in, folks. Number one, there's a couple of jokes and there's a couple of comments from people who've already been in classes of mine, and I will indulge. First thing is, I like this. Lisa Shaw says, that's a hidden feature, free head dent included on hats made with 3D satin underlay. Yeah, I don't know if free thread dent or free head branding is really something I'm looking for with my corporate hats, but hey, you never know. Curtis is late but says hello. Thank you for showing up, Curtis. And Jeff says, that's the best selling point I've ever heard. I don't believe you, Jeff. I think you're not telling me the truth here. I don't think you want the head dent. I know I don't. And Jeff says, show the lion. All right, show the lion. You know what? I can show the lion. And this is something, now I've got some other pictures I want to show you guys, but here's something I can show you when we're talking about dimension, right? Show the lion. So we're talking about all of these things in a single color. I'm actually going to show it to you first by itself, and then we'll go on from there. So let's show the lion. Let's bring it up. In fact, let's give it a nice full screen for a second so that I can bring it up to a nice large size. So I'm going to zoom in on this piece. So this lion, now, yes, you're going to say, Eric, that's two colors, but I'm going to say this is not exactly cheating because we have two different elements in this design that are being shown. That's one color in this text. And actually, I've got some dimension and stuff we can talk about with that. And we have the color that's in the lion's head. The thing that I'm going to tell you about this is all one color of thread, of course, and it's rendered entirely in satin stitches. Now, this piece, since Lisa talked about the size of pieces before, this is a jacket back. This thing is probably 15 inches from top to bottom. So this is a large piece. I've got a lot of detail in here, but there's something you wouldn't do. The amount of detail we have in these satin stitches in the muzzle, you would absolutely not do on a smaller piece. And I need to run out another large one. I've run out one of the smaller ones that I sometimes show, but this particular colorway is very nice, and I like to show this one when I can. This piece has a ton of texture and value and depth that's all about the carving and the layering. We see that in this back half, and I think that that's something that's worth looking at. That's dimension. That is the shine. That is the shadow and the satin stitches, all done in a standard polyester thread. And we see these little elements. The thing that's interesting about it is this, and this is where I talk about digitizing for dimension. On the left-hand side is your original art. On the right-hand side is the finished piece. And this is why I think it's important to think about things in a sculptural fashion. This is why I like to discuss this stuff quite the way I do, because as you can see here, entirely behind the ear, there is no detail. In the original art, there is nothing there. If I threw this at auto-digitizing, it would render it as a big black fill, and there would be nothing there to show for it. If you look on the piece on the right, the amount of detail and texture that we have in the piece on the right is nothing like the piece on the left. And this has to be done by a human being making decisions. But as you can see, these are the same kind of decisions we're talking about before. Curls of hair that are on top of lower curls, breaking things up into different shapes and using dimension and layering to make that happen. And this is something where the nature, the sheen of the thread is doing a lot of work for you. Don't get me wrong. Did I have to draw all this stuff? Yes. Do I think that this is as hard as shading a piece like this? Absolutely not. And I think that the nature of the thread gives it a lot. So if anybody ever tells you that it's single thread color design has to be boring, you can tell them that's not true. I don't think it ever has to be. And there's actually one other thing that I will bring up about this. Even in something simple like text, remember I was talking about monogramming and things like that. Even in something as simple as text, you can see, do you see how this little kind of the O that's in here that has the A in it? And yes, it looks a little bit anarchy symbol. This is a band jacket. So don't know the band, do love the jacket. Probably would wear it just because I like the piece. But what you can see is how this H, we have this really lovely kind of unseal lettering here, this unseal type lettering, like a manuscript type lettering. Do you see how the bow of this H and this L are both underneath the O so that that center letter pops up to the front and has prominence? That's layering, that's depth, and that's all done in a single color and does not require you to shade or outline or do anything else to get that work. Let's show a couple more examples while we have them. Here's another extremely simple piece. This is in the middle of a left chest design. So this is very small. We're talking about like less than 2 inches, really, really small piece. Those satin stitches on that Zia are probably, less than 1.5 millimeters in thickness. Because that's like right here is probably 1.2 millimeters, this little ridge that is on top of these scales. How much better does this design look? Because we thought about how the scales go together. This was presented to me as a solid black outline. It did not have any detail in it. All I knew is that I had scales, I had a balance, there were some other elements here, there was a star, and we had a Zia. But building it up from the background, saying the scales are in the background, and on top of that is the Zia symbol. On top of that, we have this other element in the front, and breaking that into 2 satin stitches to get that ridge, to get that texture. This piece looks lovely for such a simple thing. And we can make any single color piece look like that. And the other thing I'm going to tell you is using less fill stitches. Now, don't get me wrong. Satin stitches come with some problems with pull compensation. And they do like to ripple garments more. If you use a lot of satin stitches, they like to pull. So you do have to work on your hoop tensioning. You do have to have good stabilization behind it. You have to have a nice stabilizer. But using satin stitches like this reduces stitch count while it's providing all of this dimension. So we're controlling that depth by using stitches, knowing that on a satin stitch, the angles between 2 different angles of satin stitches, we're going to get 2 colors. We're going to get 2 different renditions of the same color, 2 values, and that the ridges, the shadows, and the shine are going to give us dimension by default. We're going to have that without doing any other work. So layering elements in a single color design in just such a way, which is hilarious. I just realized that's exactly what I said in my own Instagram post. Layering the designs in just such a way provides this extra depth, and it provides a look of luxury. And that's what we sell on for embroidery, luxury items. It is a higher quality luxury item. It looks cared for. If you see all the stuff that's going on in heat press right now, where they're doing all these dimensional pieces, they're doing like rubber and foil stamp, and they're dimensional and molded. Why are they doing that? They're doing that not because that's something that's incredible that we've never seen before. It is a way for them to try and break heat press further into embroidery, because embroidery is the decoration of dimension. That is what it's for. That's what it does better than anything, is having real dimension and looking like an object. It's not just laid on top of the fibers. It is put into the garment. It is a part of the garment, and it is durable and luxurious and has this extra look to it that's interesting. Another piece here, single color piece, and this is not the best photo. It came out a little hot from the lighting, but this is a rendition of zozobra. If you're somebody from New Mexico, been to New Mexico, up in Santa Fe, you've seen this before. We burn Old Man Gloom in effigy, and I'm not lying. We have a big 40-foot tall puppet that waves its hands around, and it's how we get rid of gloom in the year. We burn Old Man Gloom up there in Santa Fe, and this piece was handed to me once again as a single color, absolutely flat silhouette. However, people who are from here, we know Old Man Gloom has a big giant nose and big eyebrows and these big spindly fingers and a belt and a bow tie that is part of the look. It is part of what makes Old Man Gloom look like what he is. And when we want to render that, it was not a big deal for me to use. Yes, I used some fill stitch in this thing. However, I broke the arms apart. I broke the wrists apart. The collars, the fingers are broken apart into satin stitches. The nose, the ears, the brows, the lips are all layered, and they're broken out in a light density satin that's on top of the fill. So I didn't even have to do much work for it. And it ends up giving you the shine and the shadow and the dimension. So that's the thing we have to do right there. We have to make that happen. And even in the flames, you'll see that the flames are actually what run last. The rest of the design runs first. The flames run last because they run on top of Old Man Gloom. Why? Old Man Gloom is sitting further back in, and the flames are burning in front of him. And so we have the little curves of the flames on top of that body that gives us depth. And it makes a piece that would have been very pedestrian, very normal looking, very boring, into something that shines. When someone is wearing this jacket and that icon is on their yoke and they turn, someone sees all the little details. And one of the things that makes customers happy, it's novelty is one of the things that gets them. The other thing is this concept, this wonder they have when they see this hidden detail. If you've ever liked Easter eggs in a movie or a video game where you like to see that little hidden detail somebody made just for you to notice it, that's the thing that we're looking for. Marianne asks, she asked how big it was. Zozobra on this piece, and Zozobra on this piece, if I'm correct, I'm thinking a little over 2¼ to 2½ inches. It was done as a yoke piece. It couldn't possibly be 3 inches. So it's also a very small piece. That's why it's done just single color with not a ton of detail in it. Has some very small details added to it. I would say probably about that size. I'd have to look at that for sure. So yeah, that's one of those things that I really do enjoy. So that's what I like to see in this kind of piece. We're talking about making that single color work out. Now let's go ahead. There's a couple other things I want to get to before we finish finish. There's something that I really wanted to hit is about pathing. And it's one of the ways that I learned pathing when I was entirely on my own. And this is before I had any other understanding of embroidery. I was doing this all on my own, kind of literally. It was in a production room with the manual to my software and nothing else. That is all I had. And one of the things I did was look at hand embroidery, because I looked at any embroidery I could to get inspiration. And one of the things I looked at was black work. And we see black work like this. It's like 16th century black work, quite old black work. And this very page is one of the ones I looked at. And I'm actually going to show you this. If you know the internet, you know this is old. This is a 20-year-old web page. And you can see the link that's on the top of it. But this is very much one of the greatest ways to learn pathing I've ever seen. Now, admittedly, this is just a very simple counted black work stitch, right? It's very simple counted black work stitch. And what it tells you, though, is something that actually bears out for doing machine embroidery and black work now. When we're doing this kind of stitch, and I'll show this again, this kind of motif that was done on collars and cuffs and things like that. This is something we're talking about, the very old hand embroidery technique. Well, this is kind of how it's done in a double running stitch. You skip every other stitch and then come back, and the design front and back looks the same. But there is a principle of this that's really interesting, and that is that you have a journey out and a journey back, and you're only ever covering things the same amount of thickness. Now, in this case, in hand embroidery, because we're working on both sides, what we do is we skip areas and then come back, and we're only using one course. But here's what's interesting. You work to a place on a line where you turn somewhere else or where you have to turn around, and then you work back. And that is the trip out and the trip back, the tour. And it's something that I teach now when I teach pathing, when I teach black work. And this is what's interesting, right? To do a journey and a side trip. And this is super interesting stuff. So I have to credit them, because this is one of the pages I know I looked at when I was learning this stuff and when I figured it out on my own. It's also, if you think about someone who says, okay, we're going to go ahead and try and solve a labyrinth. We're solving a maze. Keep your shoulder on the right wall and eventually you'll get out. Well, this is the kind of thing. We stay on a path until we hit a branch, take the branch until we get to the end, and then come back. And it's the same thing you do with digitizing for machine embroidery to some degree. You can see what we're talking about. We're on this main journey. We're going to start on the main journey until we hit this side trip, go out to the side trip, work it around to the end, and then work it back to our starting position. And this is exactly what we do, certainly in a different method with machine embroidery, because what we're doing is adding 2 passes and making sure every one of these side trips only has 2 thicknesses of thread in any line. But it's a very similar way to go. As we're working a line, even on a very complicated design, we can work on a line, work on an edge, work from a central detail. And every time we hit an intersection, we can go on a side trip knowing that we have to find our place to turn back around and come back to the main trip and back to our origin point. And the hilarious thing is that we can analyze that in side trips. So I have to say thank you very much to this very old webpage about Elizabethan black work and some of the books that I took out from the public library when I was a young embroiderer and learned about this kind of basic embroidery. The thing is, that embroidery helped me do this embroidery. It's the same sort of way. You start in an area, and this particular piece was actually done for a cap. So this piece being done for a cap, I started in the center of this piece, worked out toward the edges, doing these tours, trying to fill in as much as I could toward the center, and then worked back to the middle and worked out to the other side and back to the center again. And I did the very same technique, just in a more complicated fashion. So it's something I absolutely had to show you guys. And with that, the other kind of things I want to show you very briefly, just a couple of quick replays of designs that are up on my YouTube channel, because I like to show you guys this stuff. If this will behave, I will show you a couple of quick replays. And these are just replays of single color designs so you can see the way they travel. You see how I'm taking little short tours and coming back? It's a little fast, but you can see I keep returning back to my point. I leave from that main area, do a tour, return back, and keep continuing on. And this is the same technique that you're going to see in that incredibly simple counted work in black work. This particular piece, I see that I've left a little void in the center that I probably should have tried a little harder to avoid. If you leave voids in the middle of a design where you're doing this, you might get a little pucker there. But at the same time, you can see I went out from that center point. Every single line has exactly 2 passes, and I returned back to my center point again. Now, admittedly, I found that I'd left that void and I filled it in at the last minute, but I returned to my center point in the very same way. And I thought that was fairly interesting. We'll back off of the ads from YouTube here. But here's one other piece that's also on my YouTube channel. And this is a very simple piece, a turkey. It's one that I've given away many times. You see, I start on the foot. I take little tours off of the main line I'm working on and come back to that same line that I go back in. And I love this comment from Justin here. Yeah, follow the breadcrumbs back to your origin. Sometimes it's hard to do in the software because the visualization is hard to see where you've been. But if you keep in your mind the idea of the main road and the side trips, you go off into the neighborhood until you reach the end of the line and then come back the way you came, you will be able to do incredibly detailed work like this and keep it from having any sort of trimming, any sort of problems with pathing. And you'll see a lot of my pieces are like this, where I'll come in from an edge and end by finishing the edge with a nice thick border. Because the other thing is that sometimes I will actually want to work a border. Now, once again, let's get rid of all the YouTube stuff that we have on there. I will want to work on a border and actually make a border thicker at the last moment. I've often wanted to have a third pass on the very outside run. So I sometimes like to do that, but you'll also see me working from the center out because I like to smooth things over. The other thing I'll show you is another very early example of how we get that kind of secret Easter egg kind of look. Once again, this 2012, so this is a long time ago, folks. I've been doing this a while. This is a piece of a bucket. You know, is this like a backhoe or a bucket? I have to say I don't know the proper term for this guy. But this is like a bucket lifter or some sort, a big construction machine. And in this particular piece, it was done on an applique. It was kind of a last minute thing. They hand this off to us and say they wanted to have a reward or an award jacket instead of doing any sort of other awards or medals or trophies. And this award jacket was done last minute. And I was like, man, they gave me this art and all it is, it's cut out. It has this horrible kind of flat line on the bottom where you can see that it used to be a square image. They wanted to throw it on this piece. It didn't look real great. And I thought, you know what? I really wanted to do something special. So even though it looks pretty flat on that left-hand picture, if you look on the right-hand side, as you turn it in the light, I've cut apart those pieces. I've used my stitch angles. I'm using my sheen. I'm using my depth. And you see how the treads are separate from the body of the machine. Excavator. Thank you. I've lost that word. So thank you, Mark, for saying that. Excavator. But the treads are on top of the body. You can see that the arm and the bucket are made of different pieces of different angled fills and satin stitches. The hydraulic rams are satin stitches. And as you turn this in the light, it looks like you have taken a black spray paint and covered your excavator up entirely and murdered it out, and that you're looking at it in 3 dimensions. Using that building up of layering, using the texture, using the sheen of the thread means that you can get, like I say, for free. Now, it takes work on the front end. It takes work on the digitizing end. It takes work imagining what it's going to be, but breaking that object up into multiple blocks of stitches gives us all of that in a single color design. But the thing is, even when we go to a multicolored design, knowing how stitch length, knowing how texture, knowing how layering works allows us to figure out how we're going to build a design. We throw in different wrinkles in pathing and sequencing when we have color because we want to make sure we keep colors together for efficiency's sake. But it lets us talk about the balance between what we want to layer in space and what we have to do for efficiency. And if we're already looking at it as a function of making that dimension, it lets us express ourselves more. It means that we can do more with less, number one, when we're doing single colors. And it means that as we go into multiple colors, let's say we need a slight difference in shade between 2 pieces, we might decide to use stitch angle to get it. We might say that if we have like a faceted item, a blade, or maybe we have like text that is beveled and is supposed to look like it's carved, maybe we just use 2 angles of the same color stitching and recognize that the 2 stitch angles are going to give us different light effects, and we don't have to use a second color if it's just a variation on the same color. It means we get to reduce things for efficiency. It also means that we can amp up the dimension, amp up the depth. Even when we have something that is done with shading, we can decide to use stitch length. We can decide to use layering to make it look more dimensional, to make it look more realistic, or just to give it that pop to make it look better. And like I said, there are always things that I think are interesting to look at. And I'll go one more example before I cut out here, guys. I know we're already in bonus time, but I think that there's one more example that's kind of the other classic example I really love to show. A couple of those here, but here's one of them. Here's this piece. High-end clothing company, and I've shown this to people. You've been in one of my classes, you may have seen this before. High-end clothing company comes in and they want this on garment bags for people who are buying very expensive clothing. We have a private shopper and we have somebody buying very expensive clothing, right? So what are we looking to do? We want this to look luxury. We want this to have a sense of being something valuable. If I run this as a flat fill, what are we going to get? Well, we get kind of a muddy sense of where the arms start and end. These two arms look pretty weird on these ladies. There is a way where if you really wanted to torture your mind, this arm could be tracking over here. It could be behind this lady and her arm is on her hip. Now, I know that it's not, and we kind of have a sense that it's not, but this looks pretty muddled. There's not a lot of definition here in the logo itself. So why don't we do something with our dimension, with our superpower that embroidery gives us to make this better, to make it look like something more? Well, we can, and here it is. We separate our elements and we use these things. Now, this is something that I've talked about with digitizing for dimension, certainly, but I like to make it really a function of single color because using a single color forces you to execute using all these different things we're looking for, right? All these different topics that I talked about earlier. What do we have here? We're looking at stitch type differences, right? We have the differences between these stitches. We have a fill stitch, curved fills being used for the clothing so that they are smooth, but not as smooth, not as cylindrical, not as shiny, not possessed of a shadow and a highlight the way we have for the legs, the way that we have for the arms, the way we have for the face and the hair. So sincerely, we have a difference in stitch type. What is that partially giving us? A difference in texture. We still have a very even texture. The fill stitches are regular. They are not randomized, so it doesn't look like they're wearing fur dresses. It looks like smooth material, but it looks like material, and that looks different than what I wanted for the skin. I wanted the skin to look smooth, so anything that is a person is done in a satin stitch or a length limited satin. That's it. We are looking at layering. If you look at the arm on the woman who is obviously in the back, the woman on the left is behind the woman on the right. We've decided that. How can we tell? Well, we look at the original art. We can tell that the bags that the woman on the right is holding are occluding the woman on the left's legs. So she's supposed to be in the front, right? She's supposed to be in the front. That's the way we can take that. So we'll go ahead and say she's in the front. So I'm going to decide that her arm is in front of the other woman's arm, and that arm will go over the woman's arm who's got it on her hip. Now we know who's in front. We've oriented them in space. They look like they're standing in an actual space. They look like they are in place, and they make a little more sense. And also, you see, because we layer the dresses on top of the limbs, we're getting that extra shadow in the arms. We're getting it in the neck, where those dresses look like they are on the people. So we've got our texture differences. We have our layering and depth. And we've got the sheen because we're looking at thread. This is a polyester thread. It is something that I knew is going to have to be laundered, these pieces, and they had to wear pretty roughly because if we're traveling with garment bags, they're going to get roughed up. So polyester for this piece as well. But we also have density. If we look at the bags, part of what was going on in the art for the bags, right? If we go back to the art, we can see that the bags actually had a more dense look to them. We have also a polka dotted bag that's in the middle that is just not going to work at this size. This is a very small decoration. We're not going to get it, but we can still say we've got a horizontal stripe here. We got a vertical stripe here. That's enough for us to tell them apart and to give ourselves some work there that we can work with. And so we've done that here. What do we decide to do? We've got an angle for the lines on the little small bag here. We've got these vertical stripes. We've got these horizontal stripes. And we use nice long stitches. Do they still look pebbled? Absolutely they do. When you're working on black with a light color of shiny thread, you are going to get breaking in those lines. There's no way you won't. So you are going to get a little bit of a pebbled look. However, we're still getting a shinier look. We're getting a longer, less pebbly look because we use longer stitches when we're in the bag. And you see the density. We're leaving a lot of open space so that we're getting the black showing through on the bag, that we're getting a different look than a solid pink. We wouldn't want solid pink across those bags. We want them to have a different tone. And because we have tighter stitching on the back bag and looser stitching on the front bag, the back bag looks like it's made of a lighter color. In our mind, we're telling ourselves that's a brighter color versus the other one in this one color design. So as you see, we have the dimension, we have the layering, we have the density, we have the texture, we have the sheen, and that's all being controlled. And a lot of it's being controlled by the digitizing. The thing is, knowing this, when I go to do outlines on a multicolor design or details inside of a badge or inside of a seal, I know how close things have to be together to still have daylight between them. I know this because I've done a lot of work on single color designs. And I think that working in these designs is really instructive. So let's go ahead and back out of this for a minute. I could have shown you a million more examples. We are just about to the edge of bonus time. I don't want to go over another 15 minutes past this thing. I hate to say I'm passionate about this topic, so it's hard for me not to do this. But let's go ahead and talk about the things we talked about again and give you just a little bit more of a recap before we finish off. What are we going to say here? Embroidery is dimensional. everything I talk about every week, we're going to talk about embroidery being dimensional. Get used to the fact that I think of it as an object, because believe me, it is. It is three-dimensional. If you use it in a dimensional way, it is going to look better. Can we do awesome shaded embroidery that's not a dimensional, where the stitch angles are all the same direction? We can. It's a different look. I think that one of these superpowers that is unique about embroidery, because blending is something that print does very well. Flat blending looks great in print. Doesn't always look as good in embroidery. So though you can do it in embroidery, and it's an excellent technical thing you can learn to do, it's not embroidery's unique power. Embroidery's unique quality is that it is dimensional. What are the things that we can control in a single color? Texture. We can control texture through our stitch types, our stitch angles, through our length. We can control how those the textures look and how they interact, and through our materials. If we use a textured thread. Sheen. How do we control that? Once again, stitch length, again, to a degree, gives us that reflection, but the sheen of the thread itself controlled through the fiber that we're using, the type of thread and the treatment. Depth. Through layering, through building things dimensionally, we can show depth. What occludes something behind it? What is in front? What is behind? Building from the back of the picture plane to the front. Density. How close together are the lines? That's all we have to know. That's all density is. How much daylight can we see between those stitches? What does that do as far as interaction and patterns that we can make? Say we have two light density pieces on top of each other. What can we do to make different patterns? If you saw me talk about detail previously, I believe last week I showed some things about how you can make different patterns. Like I've done small flags. We use small flags where we have the US flag has a field of stars. Instead of drawing little white stars, have a white field behind it and draw a mesh of blue on top of it, and little white diamonds appear. Looks close enough at a very small piece. So we talk about density, and it works for all sorts of things. Using density, layering densities is important for blending, for engraving work, for detail work, for shading, always. The other things we get to control, color. The color combinations that we're using, whether we're tone on tone, whether we have a lot of contrast, less contrast, this is important to the finished look. And the things we learn, what do we learn from working on single color designs? Pathing. Pathing. Which directions are we going? How do we start and end? How do we connect things? How do we start somewhere and go out and come back? We do that traveling, our trips out and our trips back to our main road. That's pathing, and that is the essence of pathing, is being able to do that and only go and travel as many times over a line as we want to. Certainly, when we're doing stuff for efficiency and just traveling between objects, it's a lot easier if we're very good at doing pathing for engraving style work. Once again, the density. We learn how to control density. We learn how our digitizing affects the value of the fill that's in front of us. We learn about stitch types. What stitch types produce what sort of surface qualities? Satin stitches are shiny. They have long, unbroken areas. They don't have any stitch penetrations breaking those up. Fill stitches, when they're regular, look shinier, but when they are irregular, look more organic, when they have roughness. We learn about underlay. And that lets us understand how, when we build dimensionally, we build structural underlay, we can lift things up and add loft, add dimension, and we learn how underlay provides coverage. These things are all learned when we're working on single color designs. We don't have to get into excess color or excess materials or multimedia or anything else to make these things obvious to us. So I think that working on fine, refined single color designs can really teach you a great deal. So with that, folks, I think it is time to end the take up for this week. And I think that we are finally, we've had some bonus time. Everybody who thinks bonus time only starts at 1:15. Well, you got 2 minutes of true bonus time out of me today, guys. I had a couple of questions I really couldn't get to, and I'll have to say some of these things are things I'll have to tackle later. I know that I saw a question about a single color lace. Lace making, not my entire strong suit, something that I know Brian Bailey has done a lot of. I may be picking his brain about that, because I think lace making is something that's very interesting. I'll say this: you need to tie everything in. If it doesn't overlap and tie in correctly and stitch together correctly, it will wash apart. Ask me how I know. I tried to make lace by myself with my own patterns, got real close, but didn't tie in enough, and ended up washing the inside of my lace away from my borders. So yeah, that's something we'll have to learn, but we can talk more about that later. Lace is something I think I'd like to cover at some point. Something that's not always in the corporate world with me, and certainly I've only done it for my own work and for some people who are doing bridal work, but it's something interesting we can talk about later. And I'll have to say a couple things that are also here. By the way, thank you everybody who told me about the excavator, because for some reason the excavator left my mind for that moment. Clay saying he was talking about the dimensional pieces we were talking about the city chic design I just showed you. No way an automatic tool can that, nor make the proper assumptions. Yeah, no, automation can't do that. Automation can do awesome stuff that helps us. We're not having to drop individual stitches unless we want to, but automation is not for making choices about art. Choices about art you should make, right? Choices about art you should make. I can also say, Ramona says, Jeff does great lace, and Jeff loves doing lace. Well, you know what, Jeff? Maybe I'll ping you too. We'll talk about lace, my friend. That's something I've done, but not as much. And when I've done it, I think that it's something I'd like to know more of. I've followed some classic models of old school lace and some Etz lace that was from quite a long time ago, but I would like to learn some more things about lace and certainly try some more. I've got actually a couple pieces that I haven't stitched out yet that I may be sharing later. But in any case, thank you guys all for being here. I really appreciate it. What I would love for you to do, share with me some of your favorite single color designs, and also share the YouTube page with people, share the Facebook page with people, show them this stuff. Anybody who you think is on the bead, who wants to know more about embroidery, who wants to get that essential understanding, share it so that they can join this conversation with us too. Share topics. Let me know what kind of stuff you want to talk about. Maybe we'll be doing some lace work later. We'll have to see how that plays out. And I will have to see you guys later with more and more information. I think that any of the things that we've done, we could do 2, 3, 4 series of topics on. And with that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and leave you with a little bit of video. It might have a little bit of a loud sound to it. But we've been doing some sampling, and this thing that I tried to work on for an intro earlier today, but I'm going to go ahead and leave you with this. It's going to mute me out, so quiet down your sound if you don't want to hear a machine running. But this is some of the beauty, though there are multiple colors in the field, of running on single color designs. And I cannot wait to get back into it again next week. Comment, leave the comments if you're watching the replay. Just because it's not live doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. Comment, share, and I cannot wait to get back into the Takeup with you next Friday.